So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kate. But before I do that, I wanted to show you something on the screen here. Let's see. I went back to the beginning here. One of the things I wanted to start with the let's see the a quote by the Dalai Lama, I think, which is very. You can read that. I think this is very interesting because people don't think of him as an immigrant, and I think part of the issues of immigration is too many people at least in the United States, they have a preconceived notion of what an immigrant is, and they don't realize how far they can go or who they are, where they've come from. And this is really interesting how he viewed that as it formed his life. The other thing I wanted to show you, which is really interesting, and I've been saying this for a long time, and I'm amazed at how many Americans, at least the ones I've encountered, who think the U.S. is the only country in the world that has problems with immigration. And as you can see from this, no, we are not. Human movement and displacement has accompanied human history hand in hand for a very, very long time. You don't have to memorize this. You can see that the numbers here. So that's what I always try and tell some of my more, I guess, resistant friends in terms of understanding the concept of immigration a little bit better. One of the things I thought was really interesting is how certain classes of immigrants are perceived. We have, like, from China, they're called high net worth individuals. This was really interesting. So these are the immigrations of individuals who are millionaires. They have at least $1 million. So you can see that we have 10,000 of them emigrated to the United States. That's an interesting kind of thing. So they have different kinds of doors are open to them where other doors are closed to other immigrants. It's really, really interesting to see. So that's my spiel. I just wanted to share that information in terms of how immigrants are perceived in this country. All right, without further ado, I think I'm going to pass it on to you, Kate. It's all yours.
Yeah. Thanks, guys, for being there. I'm Kate Ayers, and I am the executive director at ReEstablish Richmond, which is a local community-based organization located in Richmond, Virginia. I see Molly is here with us today. She's my other Richmonder, and so I'm grateful to be with you all today and be with such a diverse and group of individuals. I thought I would go ahead. Do I have screen? Am I able to, are you able to help me share my screen? Okay. So ReEstablish Richmond, like I said, is an organization that's been around for 10 years. And we were formed in 2010 to respond to the needs of the immigrant and refugee community. And part of our birth story, I guess you could call it, is that there was a large number of Burmese refugees, people from Myanmar, resettling in Richmond, and they showed up at the doors of a church here in Richmond looking for a faith community because they had been, one of the reasons why they left Myanmar or forced to leave is because they were unable to practice their religion safely in Myanmar. So they arrived in Richmond looking for a church home, and the church, of course, welcomed them. They infused a lot of life into this faith community. The church was kind of in the city and had slowly died off over the last decade previously, and a new pastor was there and ready to get things going. And so they really, this group really gave a lot of energy and life back into this church. And what they discovered was that they learned a little bit about the refugee resettlement system, the formal system, and that this group of folks did qualify for a certain level of services offered by the Office of Refugee Resettlement through resettlement agencies, but those agencies were very limited in terms of how long they were able to provide services, what kinds of services, and then what types of immigrant categories or immigrant statuses they were able to support. And after you look at that sort of bigger picture, you realize, oh, wow, a lot of people are falling through the cracks of that formal system. A lot of people's needs were not getting met. And so ReEstablish Richmond was kind of born to fill those gaps in resettlement. I entered the picture. I was a public school teacher for the first 10 years of my career and worked in a pretty rural area, not very diverse, but had taken a class about social justice and was sort of enlightened about the refugee crisis worldwide and sort of how local communities responded to that. And so I got involved as a mentor through Catholic Charities, which is one of the resettlement agencies here in Richmond, and got intimately involved with a family from Eritrea. The relationship that formed, of course, transformed my life and my perceptions of the experiences of immigrants and refugees. And then sort of got me interested in this issue, got connected to this church that I was mentioning, had a lot of Burmese folks. And then just sort of just was in a point in my career where I was ready to make a switch and I wasn't sure what it was going to be. And my friend Patrick, who was the founder of ReEstablish Richmond, invited me to come to like a mission vision night for the agency. And I went and I left and I said, this is my next step. And so I got involved sort of at the very infancy of the organization, where we were sitting around talking about our mission, talking about our vision. And because of my background in teaching, I was sort of tasked with getting some programs running. And so our first program you'll learn about was transportation, and I'll tell you that story in a bit. But that's a little bit about me and my experience. I've spent the last like 7 or 8 years. Every year, is this the right place for me professionally? And every year I get drawn in more and more as I just develop myself about learning what it means to work in the nonprofit sector. And then also just being able to see sort of the impact of our organization and sort of the ways that our network building, both within the refugee community, so strong relationships with the different immigrant and refugee communities in Richmond, but then also sort of the networks that we've built with our volunteer network and faith community network and other community agencies. It's been really exciting to sort of see how those connections build webs of support and a more inclusive community. But before I move forward, I'd love to hear from those of you who are here. What do you hope to learn? What questions do you want answered today? I feel like we're all sort of probably coming to the table for different reasons. I don't know the backgrounds of the audience members. So if you feel comfortable, maybe just unmuting yourself or typing it in the chat. If you're at a place where you can do that, share with me maybe who you are and what are you hoping to learn or hear today.
Well, I can start since I have a face. I'm
Yes,
not a panelist. I'm not a panelist, but I have a face, and my background is just from another webinar that I was at yesterday. I forgot to change it, but I'm here at home. I've been at home for 2 years. I got laid off right before the pandemic hit, and I was a 30-year education abroad director at 5 different schools, sort of building offices, and so that's how I know Tom. We also, I think, know each other through Gateway, and Gateway is this kind of consulting information resource company that's been created during the pandemic by a former SIO, a senior international officer at universities. And so it has a lot of people in the group that are sort of managing or consulting small projects. And I'm in charge of a webinar series that is designed to help people learn how to rebuild programs for students, whether they're virtual or in person, now that the pandemic and the COVID is with us sort of to stay. I mean, it's always going to be around. So students want to go, and what are we going to do, and how is it going to be different than before? And we have our first one next week. They're all free webinars. But in about, I think it's February or March. I think it's February. We have one based on high impact practices, community-based learning. So meaning working with communities abroad. But these days, I think working with communities abroad is going to be either virtual, or we're also going to have students hook it up to working here in this country with communities that are diverse. So I'm getting people for that panel. So I'm attending webinars where people are talking about these things, just to sort of hear who the people are who are doing things that might be relevant for what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Do you have any questions you're hoping?
Not
to learn
yet.
about?
Not yet.
Okay. Feel free to ask them as they come. Is there anybody else who'd like to share or ask a question? I see a couple questions. Great. Any other thoughts before we get moving forward? Great. Well, I'm going to give you sort of an overview of our work and sort of our approach. Some of the initial few slides I'll probably skip over because they're more about like refugees and what's the difference between a refugee and an asylee, unless someone does want some of that, like, sort of level setting conversation. Let's see. So I already talked with you a little bit about how I ended up with ReEstablish Richmond. So I'm going to keep going. I already shared with you a little bit about our mission and why we were formed in the first place. What I'll say about the worldwide refugee crisis is, Tom showed us sort of the picture of how complicated immigration is and migration. And, when you really look at the numbers, and these numbers I got off the UNHCR website before the current crisis in Afghanistan. So I'm making an assumption that the numbers are going to be, definitely larger now that we have sort of a mass exodus happening out of Afghanistan. But, when we're thinking about these issues, we're starting with such an overwhelmingly large number of almost 80 million people who've been forced out of their home, forced displacement. And that number does include all the different reasons. So from economic to environment to war to persecution. And then when we sort of narrow it down a little bit, today's conversation that I'm going to be having really does focus more on the refugee asylee side of things, just because that's the space that ReEstablish Richmond fills more. I recognize that there's a lot other trends of immigration that aren't related to forced displacement. So when I'm talking about immigrants today, I'm really talking mostly about the refugee community, because that is who primarily makes up our client base. That said, that's one of the gaps that we fill, is we don't require any kind of immigration status to be able to provide services. But this term refugee really is, I've talked to people, if you have resettled permanently in a third country as a refugee, then the odds are sort of like you've won the lottery, because the number of folks who are eligible versus the number of people who actually get those services, it's quite staggering. I think it's less than 1% of all this 26.0 million refugees do get resettled permanently. And this 26 million there's plenty millions more people who would qualify, but this is the number of people who've actually obtained that status through the UNHCR. And I don't think we talk enough about the fact that, we have this very powerful organization that gets to define it, who gets the status and who doesn't, despite what people's realities may look like. It is sort of a system that's built upon power, somebody in power defining it. This is just where I mentioned that, only a very small folks, of course, in the United States, we have refugees coming through the formal resettlement system, but then we have asylum seekers who are coming, across borders from the southern border, saying that they can't return back home. And so there's two different sort of processes happening. and which is what makes this current situation in Afghanistan so interesting, because it's created a situation where we have a very large mixture of what that looks like. And now I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit more specifically about Afghanistan. And so Richmond and Washington, D.C., as well as several other, I think Texas and California, or several other states who have large numbers of special immigrant visa holders, folks from Afghanistan who did work with the military, and because of that have this sort of special status that allows them to get a green card right away and a clear-cut pathway to citizenship. And so when we're thinking about the Afghan community, before August, the majority of Afghans were here on a special immigrant visa. There were certainly a smaller percentage of people here with refugee status. But the current situation has kind of created this whole new immigration status that the State Department is still trying to figure out, quite honestly. It has a terrible name, the Afghan Parolee. And, currently more than, I think at this point, it's like 55,000 Afghans have entered the Dulles airport, and the majority have been sent to military bases across the country for processing. And what has created such difficulty is this is a mixture of people. Some of them are citizens who have dual citizenship in US and Afghanistan. Some of them were just US citizens working in Afghanistan. Some of them are green card holders in the US, but also Afghan citizens, and maybe they were visiting Afghanistan when this happened. Some of them are qualified special immigrant visa holders, so need very little processing, like they were already on their way to getting that visa, but just hasn't gotten it, so needed to come to the military base to finalize that processing before they can leave. But the large majority of folks who were able to get on planes are people who are relatives of SIV holders, relatives of people who were journalists or providing, worker. Questions, they're kind of coming here and seeking asylum. And so instead of making them go through the asylum process, which is extremely expensive, style Afghan Parolee that's being afforded to them. And so that's what's happening at the military bases, is folks are trying to do the paperwork and all the processing and background checks to see if they qualify for this. And if they do, then they will be able to be here with this status 1 to 2 years. I think it's been debated how long the status would last. But once that status is expired, then currently the way the system is, they would have to reapply for Afghan parole status, apply for asylum, or they would have to leave, because essentially they would lose their immigrant status, which, is going to be problematic. So I think the State Department and Congress is trying to look for other pathways for this group of Afghans to be able to attain permanent residency, but currently there isn't a plan for that. It's just this temporary period of being able to stay. Any questions so far about what I've shared? Okay. Tom also painted it's very complicated. I think I just sort of said, I love this picture. And it's a good one to, if anybody has a lot of questions about, like, why is this so difficult? Why can't we figure it out? Well, this is a good visual for that. Also, a lot of people have questions about, vetting, and are especially talking about the situation in Afghanistan. Is it safe for us to welcome these folks in? And what I'll say, the reason why the military bases are so packed with people and why people are having to stay so long is because this is what's taking place for each individual who is trying to obtain the status, is this level of, agency background checking, questions that people have. Every Afghan who's leaving the military base have been required to get the COVID vaccine. So there's a lot of, like, I think, narratives that people could form around this story, but I think understanding some of those important tenets of the background checking that's taking place, the fact that they are fully vaccinated before they enter into our communities is a really important way that we can help educate the community. In the US, these are some trends, and I think it's, worth noting. Obviously in the last 4 years, we hit all-time lows around numbers of folks welcomed through the refugee resettlement system. Created sort of this not great scenario, because our systems over the last 4 years of resettlement have been slowly broken down. And so we have this situation where there's all kinds of people. Resettlement agencies are looking at tripling, quadrupling the number of folks that they've resettled compared to last year. And so that's just, everyone's trying to rebuild their capacity, which has created, a situation where there's to meet the needs. I like to show this just because it gives a little bit of historical context. This is not the first time that we've seen this happen in our history. It happened in Vietnam when over 130,000 people arrived at military bases. And so I think when we're thinking about how to respond to the situation, looking at history and talking to people who did, respond to this humanitarian need, and what did communities do to respond to make it successful versus not successful, is a conversation that I'm hoping that we're having. And as an organization here in Richmond, I'm trying to bring, groups of people together to collaborate and have some of these conversations with people who've lived this in the past. Resettlement across the US, of course, has mirrored the conflicts across time and history. I'm not going to go into this a little bit because I do want to get into sort of ReEstablish Richmond's community-based approach. But here's some statistics here in Virginia, and how, in 2020, I think our numbers, were really low. 2021, we were down to, in Richmond, 150. And to give some perspective, we're looking at resettling close to possibly 900 to 1,000 folks in Richmond in this next year. So it is going to be a big jump. There is this whole network of support out there for folks who have refugee status. ReEstablish Richmond, like I said, was formed to sort of fill all these gaps that the formally funded federal agencies can't serve. And so when you're having conversations about how can I increase, community building and get to know immigrant communities, the first thing that I tell people is reach out. Who's in your community? There are 9 different agencies nationwide that provide resettlement, and they're located across the country. And these are just a few of them: Catholic Charities, Church World Services, Ayers, which is a Jewish organization. Here locally, we have Sacred Heart Center, which is more of a Latino immigrant organization. And I say ReEstablish Richmond is more of the non-Latino immigrant support system, our capabilities. But find out who's in your community and who is doing what services. We, as an organization, currently are responding to the Afghan situation. We see ourselves very much as sort of a hub and a collaborator and a coordinator of what's going on broadly. So we created an Afghan evaluation page that has some great resources, both for the Afghan community themselves. So Afghans who are looking to understand the different pathways that they could, doesn't look like it's loading very well, to community resources. So if you are someone who wants to volunteer your time or donate money or donate items, these are the different places in your community that you can go to. Across the country, no matter where you are, housing and affordable housing is going to be the greatest need. So if you do have refugee resettlement wherever you are located, you know, if you know people who have affordable housing options, or if you know anything, that's a huge asset. Because of the sheer numbers of folks coming into communities right now, the resettlement agencies and staff are not going to have the capacity to meet the needs that are there. So they're going to be relying heavily on volunteer support, and connecting with volunteers. You know, as an organization, community building is part of our mission, you know, ReEstablish Richmond's mission. But when you have a staff of 4 or 5, we can't do that building community and trust building with all of our clients, because we don't have the capacity to do so. So, you know, instead, what our focus on is really trying to prepare and support volunteers as they build community. And so being strategic about what that looks like, I think, is really important when you're having these conversations. So how are you supporting those people who are the boots on the ground, who are working directly with families? And, you know, what kinds of supports do they need, as well as the families that we're working with, I think is important. I always say, you know, ReEstablish Richmond, I've heard this we start from zero in every language in every home that I've ever visited, because people do have that sense, no matter what resources they had or didn't have in their previous country or the previous situation, when they arrive here, it is starting from zero. And the reality, you know, that if Claudia was here, she would be talking about the psychological and the trauma impacts of the current situation. And, you know, in this case, with the folks from Afghanistan, it really is people who were coming here who literally was like, I have 2 weeks to get out of Afghanistan, and like showing up at the airport with nothing. And so that is the starting point of a lot of folks who are coming in right now, is they literally have no physical belongings with them. They have experienced high levels of trauma getting to the airport, trying to get out of the airport. I think here in the United States, at the military bases, each military base, a lot of military bases are in smaller towns, more rural areas. So the communities aren't exceptionally welcoming to them. They're, you know, not all the resources are getting to the military bases equally. And so, you know, just sort of the re-traumatization that's happening at the military bases. And then, of course, once they're able to finally leave and find a more permanent home, it's going to be another transition. So I think understanding the transitions and the trauma and becoming trauma informed going into the work is going to be really important. From an organizational standpoint, we really try to build our programs and services based on what clients have told us they needed. So our transportation independence program really grew out of the living room. I was doing bus orientations because we knew that people needed to learn how to ride the bus. And so I'd show up at people's homes, and I showed up in a home and it was filled with Afghan women. And they said, one of those women, and like amongst of like 10 other women and 20 children, she was able to speak English. And she said, we need to learn to drive. This is our priority and we need your help. And so we launched our transportation independence program a bit more formally, where we walk people from bus all the way to car. We hold cohorts in people's native languages so they can learn the rules of driving in their native language. We connect with driving schools, help them navigate the DMV, which is a whole list of barriers to access. And so this is the program that we're actually like really investing a lot of our time and resources in, because we know this is going to be the area that people are going to need the most first when they arrive here. We do have a health and wellness programming where we gather groups of people together based on their language and cultural background. And we just have conversations about what makes you healthy and well here versus in your home country. You know, our westernized approach to health and wellness, and especially mental health, is vastly different than a lot of our client communities. And understanding what those differences are is where we start with our health and wellness program, and then building the connections to resources around that. So you can see here, we've done yoga, we've done community gardening, we've done parenting classes, we've done financial literacy courses. And then actually currently our most recent initiative is to provide emotional support for Afghan women, because after the fall of Afghanistan, all of our clients here already resettled from Afghanistan were, you know, coming to us in crisis mode and traumatized over worry about their family members. And so we were able to connect with some actually Dari speaking mental health professionals, and we worked with the local mosque, and we're having emotional support groups. It's been a great way to engage the new volunteer pool who are anxious to feel like they're contributing. So we are providing childcare, and we provide transportation so people can get there. And I think understanding, you know, just the different needs that and resources it takes to gather people together is important when you're thinking about how can I respond. I think how can you respond? It's understanding what clients actually need, and then actually doing the thing to break down the barriers. It is hard. We spend hours a week trying to with transportation logistics because we're relying on volunteers. And even if we relied on a paid person to provide transportation, it's still a lot of logistics of picking up, and everybody has, I can come this week, but not this next week. It's a lot, but at the end, it is worth it, because what happens is people are getting where they need to go, and we're actually breaking down the barriers that actually exist so they can access the things in the community that they need. Our approach to community engagement is really doing a lot of connecting of resources and communities. You see here, we have an annual World Refugee Day Community Resources Fair where we bring community resources under one roof. We provide transportation and interpretation for our clients to get there. We had over 850 refugees and immigrants come the last time that we did this in person, over 100 volunteers, 50 community vendors, and our community vendors are anywhere from social services to local children's museums to, you know, English classes, whatever resources that somebody new coming into our community might need access to. We intentionally do client engagement, meaning every person that's referred to us, we reach out to them, we assess their situation through an intake process. I think that this is really important because one thing that often happens is you have all these different organizations working at the same time with the same populations. And so duplication of services happens, you know, clients are in crisis mode, so they're asking multiple people to help them with same things. And so understanding that when someone is coming to you and sharing with you a need that they may have, understanding that's just one piece of the larger picture of their support. And so we work really hard to understand sort of what kinds of supports newcomers may have, what kind of resources they already have, what kind of resources do they not have before we begin providing services. We utilize volunteers at all levels of our organization. And I think I already mentioned, like, you know, utilizing and supporting volunteers so that they can do that community building and relationship building is really important. Our most recent program that we've been developing is around economic empowerment. That again speaks to sort of thinking about what do people actually need and designing your programs around that. It's really this Afghan women before the situation, they were coming into Richmond. They grew up during the Taliban regime, which means they did not have a lot of access to education or formal job training. But then they arrive here in the US and are expected to work 40 hours a week in order to maintain benefits or what have you. And so finding meaningful ways for them to engage that were culturally appropriate, and really helping them find ways that they felt comfortable contributing to their family. This is our answer. So we have a sewing course for women that we provide job certification at the end of when folks complete the advanced course. And we actually just launched a makers course of people who graduated, who are trying to figure out what it looks like for them as individuals to gain money from their skill that they've developed through sewing. And so we've just launched our first Gila sewing shop on our website, and we purchased items that the women from the makers group made, and now we're selling them on our website for them, and we're looking for other ways for them to do that. But it's very client based. We're really going to them. What is it that you want to do with the skill? What barriers are in your way? Is it understanding of financial literacy? Is it just connections of places to sell your items? Is it you can't afford the material and things to make your things? So we're connecting them to our networks of support to break those barriers. We have a group of storytellers who've been trained to share their stories from different immigrant communities. We've, honor these individuals. It is a paid gig for them. And so they go and they share their stories and build empathy and understanding, which I think is a big part of when we're talking about how to build welcoming communities. This is some information about what we've been up to during COVID. There was not a month where we did not match a volunteer to a client to help a client meet a goal during all of the pandemic, including like March 2020. So we're proud of our ability and flexibility. And that's one of our organizational values is flexibility and understanding. Our clients are coming to us from so many different places and so many different cultural backgrounds and experiences that, we're trying to be responsive to and understanding those situations. We have a Get Involved page. You can learn all about how to volunteer with our organization, but all organizations across the country will have this kind of setup where you can learn how to get involved. There are lots of things you can do, no matter where you're located. Even if you're in a place where there's not formal refugee resettlement, you can get involved. So, does anybody have any questions?
Kate, why don't you put your email address on the chat so people can correspond with you directly?
Yeah.
And then afterwards, we'll send that link that you had posted to everyone. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
thank you all for my
I'm sorry.
time. Yeah, I was
Well,
just going to say thank you all for listening.
If no one has a question, I'll ask a question. Have you, Kate, have you had to learn any Pashto or Dari to communicate with the Afghan refugees?
So, I mean, I know very basic, welcoming phrases as an organization, but I mean, just in my interactions and relationships I've had with folks, but, our volunteers come to us and they're always like nervous, like, well, I don't speak any other language. And it doesn't matter. I mean, our volunteers and our clients are extremely resourceful. There's a really cool app called Tarjamili, which we just discovered that we share with our volunteers. It's basically an app platform where you can access volunteer interpreters of tons of languages. And so, if you need some support that's better than Google Translate, because we know that that's not always the best way to communicate, you can use that. As an organization, we did have to invest in a formal interpretation company, like a language line, because our needs have increased so much. And our Dari and Pashto speakers, who we typically had relied on community interpreters So people who are in our client communities already that just were bilingual, we gave them employment and opportunities for jobs to be our interpreters, but they are sort of in crisis mode themselves. So they're not able to, provide this, or a lot of them, quite honestly, are being deployed to the military bases to provide services on the bases for, newly arriving Afghans. So yeah, that's a big part of our budget is language interpretation.
I've just started to do some volunteer work with a group here called Keep Our Promise. So it's interesting. I have to learn how to navigate around Rochester, New York myself before I can help show them around. But
Yeah.
it's fun. Okay, good. Thank you for putting the that app. I think that would be
I
good.
don't know if I spelled it right, so but
Well,
Google will help you with that.
That's close enough. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any comments or observations, questions?
I don't know how many people are in New York, but there's an organization that we are working with to bring to Richmond called the Narratio Fellowship.
I don't know that. That's interesting.
It's a really cool organization that was started that helps refugee and immigrant young adults learn how to tell their stories through different artistic mediums. And so they have an amazing, and they started it in partnership with Syracuse, but they're coming to Richmond to do it. We're going to have a fellowship in Richmond. They work in Texas. They work all over, but it's taking mostly kids who are like that transition age of like from college or high school to college or in college, and helping them build their leadership skills through learning how to tell their stories. And it's a beautiful program. They and they go to the Met in New York and do field trips and have, create art, and it just might connect to some of the work that some folks on this call might do.
Very good. Very good. Let's see. Anyone else? Molly, any questions? I can't tell if you have a question because I can't see I only see your picture. Your still photo.
What are some considerations for working with newcomers to understand local context to help more smoothly integrate? I think if you're on the side of working with or providing services or wanting to build relationships with newcomer communities, it goes back to really understanding sort of the landscape, right? Like, what is the bigger picture of support that is here in the community already? And where can I best fit in? Because, what I see is people don't always understand the bigger picture, and they start doing things, and maybe it's like reinventing the wheel or maybe it's, creating more confusion than necessary. And so, I'm a big believer in collaboration and working together with people. And so building, a lot of communities have like coalitions of people who provide support for immigrants and refugees. So finding out do those exist in your communities? Can you get connected with them? Here in Richmond, we have something called ARIVA, which is Advocates for Intercultural Richmond, Virginia. And it's a group that meets every other month. And it's like a very wide swath of different people, whether it's faith communities, service providers, universities. And it sort of connects to all the different people and stakeholders that might have interest in welcoming newcomers. And we have, conversations and helping build understanding about what's happening and what are the needs. So I think that that is definitely an important part of what we do and connecting to that.
See, anyone else?
Just want to say thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you
Well-
so much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I appreciate it. And thank you, Kate, for your time and for that excellent presentation. I'll do a follow-up. I'll have the video ready. I'll send the link.
Okay.
And the other links for people to have. And
Good. Thank
please,
you.
please feel free to spread the word about ReEstablish Richmond.
Yes, please do. And including in the there is a survey. It takes you 2 minutes that I would love if you would fill out about, I think, Tom, you said you would send it about like your understanding and if you grew in your understanding about any of these topics, because it helps with funding and helps me understand how I can improve what I'm doing as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I sent that, but I'll send it. I'll
Yes,
send it as a follow-up as well. That's not a problem.
thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And thank you,
Bye.
Kate. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.